This is Jiro Tanaka for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that covers everything and anything from an evolutionary perspective. And I'm here today with Dr. Robert Stevens. He's most known for having founded International Darwin Day. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Well, actually a lot later on. Dr. Stevens was, or is, Director Emeritus of Cell Biology at the Stanford Research Institute. And before that, he did his PhD in cell and molecular biology at USC and a postdoc at Yale, and then came over to the Stanford area. And we'll have a lot to talk about there. But first, Dr. Stevens, welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So for people who are new to this idea, maybe you could tell us, inform us, what is Darwin Day?
Well, as the originator of Darwin Day, I view it as a celebration of Charles Darwin's life, science, and humanity.
So for those of us who don't know out there, or for those who have just heard about this concept, why is this a cause for celebration? What's there to celebrate about Darwin Day? And what are we celebrating, and how, more importantly, how is it celebrated?
Well, how we celebrate it, we can, each organization that wishes to put on a Darwin Day celebration can do what they choose to do for it. But let me tell you what I've done here. For instance, when you were coming in the front door today, you saw my Darwin Day banner across my front door and all of my colored lights that are announcing the fact that we have Darwin Day coming up in the next couple of weeks. And so that's my way, and I've had dinners here for Darwin Day, and we just call it a celebration for Darwin Day. But more frequently than that, universities celebrate Darwin Day. As I said, we send out emails to department heads and encourage them to recognize Darwin and Darwin Day, particularly as it was leading up to his 200th birthday. Mm-hmm. And so they did their own act. We only promoted it. We didn't put on Darwin Day. That is, our corporation, our nonprofit corporation, did not actually do a big Darwin Day event. We encouraged the entire, our outreach. We outreached to people that were going to do their version of their Darwin Day.
So, I mean, lectures, symposia, keynote speakers.
Absolutely.
Dinners.
Over at Stanford, the last 5 years, for instance, they've had an afternoon of Darwin Day celebration where students and faculty came together and talked about various aspects of science and evolution. Darwin is beginning to take somewhat of a back seat because we need to move on and educate people about science. Yeah. Let me say, I think that one of the big things that I really wanted Darwin Day to do was to be events at universities and other schools, etc., that would invite the general public in to hear how science has gone forward. Science has evolved over, I mean, all of the impetus that was put forward by Darwin's discovery of natural selection as a method of development, of evolution, makes education in science something very important for our general population to understand. And so it's this way of educating a larger percentage of our population about the good news as far as science is concerned.
So this year, 2012, we are celebrating Charles Darwin's 203rd birthday?
Third birthday.
Happy birthday, Charles Darwin.
Yes, indeed.
So we were talking before about all the events that led up to the first Darwin Day. And I think you attached a certain amount of significance to that, just the things that inspired you to do it and the group of people that you had around you to help you with it. So tell us about that.
Well, as a scientist, I have been interested in evolution and Charles Darwin for a very long time. And a group of humanists that I belonged to that met at Stanford University were looking for a way to celebrate humanity, or at least humanism. And my view, I was thinking about Charles Darwin and how he might fit into this particular organization. Now, that morning that we met at Stanford in Chesterton Union building on Stanford campus, There are about 10 or 12 of us that were brainstorming about what celebrations we might bring to bear as far as our humanist philosophy was concerned.
So the discussion that was on the table was, let's celebrate something on a regular basis and make it something about the human spirit or humanism in general?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And some of the members brought up some of the ancient tribal myth sorts of things like Saturnalia and Samhain. And all the time that we were speaking, I was thinking Charles Darwin. Mm-hmm. And so eventually I mentioned Charles Darwin's name, and the group grew rather quiet, as a matter of fact, and very thoughtful. And so we began to discuss Charles Darwin's life and how he might fit into a good celebration for our group as humanists. And it was decided before the meeting was over that we would move forward with a plan to have the first Darwin Day.
Great. And this was in 1993 when these ideas were
That's correct.
just getting going.
That's correct.
Okay. And that was here in the Stanford area.
That was in the Tresidder Union building that morning in 1993. And the following year, I became the president of the humanist community. And we immediately set to work on preparing to have our first Darwin Day. Mm-hmm. And so that we would have some funds to do that, we had a grant writing committee formed, and we made a grant to the Hervey Johnson Foundation for, I think it was $37,000, of which $5,000 was to be for our very first Darwin Day. Mm-hmm. And so as the chairman of the board, we formed a Darwin Day committee that year. That was 1994. And so the first order of business was to try and think about how we were going to go about this Darwin Day celebration. And we decided to have a very big name speaker. And so it went around the room and we talked about it a good deal and came up with the idea that we'd like to have Donald Johanson be our first Darwin Day speaker. Donald Johanson is the discoverer of Lucy, and so our chairman of our committee wrote to Donald Johanson, who was at Berkeley at the time, and we got a letter back from him saying that he would be happy to be our first Darwin Day speaker, and we were very pleased to hear that our plans were going forward.
That's great. So by this time it was like 1995 then.
Our first Darwin Day, the actual Darwin Day itself, the very first one was 1995. That's correct.
Okay, so you mentioned Dr. Johanson as being the guest at your very first event back in 1995, and he is important because he discovered the fossil of Lucy, which, if memory serves me, is Australopithecus afarensis. So I'm wondering if you could maybe describe that first event and maybe why you wanted to have him, and also would be interested to hear the importance of Lucy for our understanding of human evolution. I think it's a fascinating story.
Well, I think one of the reasons why our committee wanted Dr. Johanson was because that Lucy represents an early stage, or a stage between the chimpanzees and human beings. And evolution is what our celebration is all about, because that's what Darwin Day is. Part of what Darwin Day is about evolution. And the evolution of humankind is a very important aspect to understand. And so having Dr. Johanson at our first meeting seemed to us to be a very important step forward in the understanding of how evolution pertains to the human population even of today.
And so we were talking earlier, I thought this was a really good point, and I think this is something that people should hear more often. You made this distinction, as long as we're talking about stages, right, and the temporal dimension, you make this important distinction between evolution as just change over time versus evolution by natural selection. And people very often conflate those two meanings, right?
Yes, that is true. It's easy to see that everything changes over time. You can imagine your automobile, an old automobile, to the present day ones, that's changed over time. And almost everything that we know as human beings now appears to change over time. And of course, our methods of communication, our electronic industry today, that's a far cry from the origins of electronic instrumentation. So things change over time. But change by natural selection is a biological phenomenon, and it is much more complex and takes a much longer time to develop. And so the two should not be confused, but they are both types of evolution.
Just a sort of, a point that sometimes people talk about, and so all of my biology professors, I remember them kind of getting on me about this, is that when we talk about this ancestor, they say it's the last common ancestor we had with this other branch, which is like they preferred me to say it that way on my tests and whatnot. It's not that we descended from what we think of as chimpanzees now. I think I heard another biologist talking about this recently, but rather we look at the animal as they are now, and we imagine that we have a common ancestor with them now, but back then that other species was not as they are now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the confusing things about people who want to disavow the idea of evolution, because they don't see that all the stages in between where we are now and where we came from. But it's been, it's been very well pointed out by evolutionary biologists for many, many years now.
There's a really interesting study. I just remember Daniel Nettle, who's an evolutionary anthropologist and psychologist. He did some studies on cognitive biases in people, and he did this in England, where there is not the same degree of maybe fundamentalism, not the same degree of people who are religious. So for other reasons, they were maybe not as sympathetic to evolution. This was his idea, Daniel Nettle, in his study, that it wouldn't be the same as doing the study here in America. But in England, he did the study, and he found that people seem to have a kind of cognitive bias towards what Ernst Mayr called essentialism. This idea that if a species changes, every single member in the entire species changes, sort of morphs, which of course is not the idea at all, but it's just kind of a sort of a cartoon idea of what's happening. No, it just came to my mind because it was such an interesting study that he did. Is like that there are reasons other than religion that people sort of get things wrong, but get things wrong in an interesting way. Our minds want to think this way. We want to imagine sort of every single member of the species morphing all at the same time, whereas, as you know, there's the famous study of the moths in 19th century England during Darwin's time. At the beginning, they're not, I don't remember the color, they're brown or something like that, and then the Industrial Revolution comes along and there's all this ash on the trees, and by the end they're gray, and you think they all just morphed from brown to gray, but not really. It's just that the frequency of the gray ones went up, and the brown ones were still around at the end of the century. There just weren't as many of them. So.
Well, it's interesting that you mention England, because I had a recent article come from Dr. Stephen Jones, who is one of the advisors on our Darwin Day program. He was mentioning at this time that there's a return to creationism, and a very concerning one in England. You would think that with Charles Darwin being an English figure of great stature, that the idea of evolution would be so ingrained in the population there that you'd never hear about creationism coming back in a big way. But it so happens that they're very concerned about the teaching of creationism in the schools in England at the present moment.
Interesting. So we were talking before about the first Darwin Day, the first two actually. You were describing that they were pretty momentous occasions. It was a big coup to get these great guests, and then later on the second phase of during the 90s, you said 98, 99, those were also momentous years for the celebration. So tell us how the celebration of Darwin Day changed over that first decade, or what sticks out in your memory.
Well, for the second Darwin Day that we had at Stanford again, we had Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins had just received the Humanist of the Year award from the American Humanist Association. And he was in the country, and so he came and spoke at our second Darwin Day event. And I was very happy to meet and be able to talk with him at length at the reception after his talk, because it put me in touch with some very important people in England. At that time, we had, there was a woman at the London School of Economics by the name of Helena Cronin. And Helena Cronin actually had a Darwin Day lecture, I believe it was, at the London School of Economics. And when my wife and I went to Oxford, over to Oxford for a 2.5 months vacation, we got in contact with Helena Cronin, and she put us in touch with Patrick Bateson at Cambridge University, as well as Stephen Jones that I just mentioned previously. Both of those gentlemen became part of our advisory committee for the International Darwin Day when we first set it up in the late 1990s.
Sure, that's great. So you've also talked about your changing relationship with various humanist organizations, and after you started the Darwin Day, that eventually you handed it over to the American Humanist Association. So in a way, it went from a small group of humanists here in the Stanford area to maybe to being part of something organized by or affiliated with this larger national organization.
The next major development in Darwin Day took place in the late 1990s, 1999. There was a meeting that came together between a person by the name of Matt Cherry and Amanda Chestworth and myself. They were working for the Committee for Inquiry that is based in Buffalo, and they were making a trip from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And I had been talking to Amanda about their college program, and so we made arrangements to have dinner on their way between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it was really here in Menlo Park. And so we arranged to have dinner that night, and that was again in 1999. And we had no more than sat down at the table than the mention of Charles Darwin came up. And I recall that Amanda was very enthusiastic about the idea of Darwin Day. She had had experience with Darwin from her childhood, because her father was a geologist and worked at the Guelph University in Canada. Frankly, I being from Canada as well, the two of us sat there, we two Canadians sat there and talked about Darwin Day. She was very enthusiastic about it, and so she wanted her idea, or her passion was to form a group called Secular Student Alliance. So we made the arrangement at that dinner, before the dinner was over, that we would form a 501c3 corporation that would entail both the Secular Student Alliance as well as Darwin Day celebration. The idea was that for every chapter of Secular Student Alliance that was formed, that they would be responsible to have a Darwin Day celebration. And so the very next year, the very next spring, at the University of Michigan, several people were involved in creating the first Secular Student Alliance and filing the 501c3 corporate papers. And so that was a very major move forward in the development of Darwin Day.
I see. So the second phase, about 98, 99, when you met with these people from the, you said from the CFI,
Yes.
The Center for Inquiry, you moved from this phase of it being just sort of a yearly celebration to it being an actual nonprofit organization.
The idea was to combine these two organizations, and surprisingly, within 2 years, Amanda's husband was moved from wherever he was working at that time to New Mexico, and so we decided to separate the Secular Student Alliance from Darwin Day celebration. And so we formed a second 501c3 corporation for to promote Darwin Day in 2001. Now, for the next 2 years, Amanda, we had our 501c3 corporation, and Massimo Pigliucci was one of our board members, and myself and Amanda were, and there was one more person by the name of Arthur Jackson. That made up our board for our first Darwin Day nonprofit corporation.
I am going to ask a general question here, just because it's sort of the word that all of our conversations today have been kind of revolving around this word humanism, and that's why I wanted to ask it earlier. But just describe maybe the changing relationship that you've had with different humanist groups, and what that word means for you. And I know it's going to maybe take you a little bit out of the chronology, but I just thought, just as a general sort of philosophical concept, that you seem to be interested in.
Well, as I said at the very beginning, I saw Darwin Day and Darwin himself as an individual that was very representative of what we think of as a humanist. Mm-hmm. Humanists are supposed to be cooperative people, I believe, and sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, like all of us, I guess. But I saw this as a very great opportunity to move the concept of humanism, which is for everyone to be cooperative. And Darwin represented that very clearly. Now, originally I was with the Darwin Day, or with the humanist community at Stanford, and they were there for a period of time. That group is now known as the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. And they still exist, and they still have they will have a Darwin Day coming up in just a few days.
Yeah, you also talk about how Darwin Day went from what eventually became part of the American Humanist Association,
yes,
much larger organizations.
Once Darwin Day had its own 501c3 corporation, we promoted it by our role became to promote Darwin Day as widely as we could, both nationally and internationally. And the way in which we went about that was to use, we actually purchased the email addresses of biologists, biology professors at various universities throughout the country, and to some extent in foreign countries. And so we wanted them to we wanted to expand Darwin Day in a really significant way. And so we began to email these people to go ahead and put on their own Darwin Day, because don't forget that Darwin's 200th birthday was coming up on 2009. So in the next 2 years, we had a growth of Darwin Day events around the country and the world from zero when we started, or at least from 1 or 2 to when we started in 2001, to 2003, when we had over 600 events across the country and around the world.
Wow, that's quite a jump. 600.
Well, it is certainly a very big jump.
Yeah. And
we were all very, very pleased about it. Eventually, Darwin Day was reincorporated in California, and we had a small group that, my office became central promotion for Darwin Day celebration. And we had a new board that was formed with the new 501c3 corporation. And the board was made up of Arthur Jackson as vice president, Ben Wade as our treasurer, Mary White as our recorder, and Bob Siegel from Stanford as our other member. And eventually, after 3 more years of promotion of our corporation here in California, our board began to discuss a long-term home for Darwin Day celebration. And since it was connected with the humanist community here, we felt that the appropriate long-term home was with the American Humanist Association,
I see.
which is centered in Washington, D.C. at the present time.
Nice place.
That's how that change took place, and that's why currently it's the efforts of the American Humanist, American Humanist Association. Let me say that in 2009, we had transferred it so that the American Humanists would have the responsibility for 2 years leading up to 2009, because we thought that that would be a very expansive year for and program for Darwin Day celebration. And in 2009, there were, I believe it was 893 Darwin Day celebrations around the world, of course in America, but also in 47 different countries.
In 47 different countries.
So it really had expanded very nicely, and it's still in existence. It's still there with the American Humanist Association.
Yeah. Well, as we were talking about before, you were asking me what this my magazine does, Evolution, This View of Life, and so one of the founding ideas of the magazine was to relate evolution and evolutionary science to people's everyday lives. To show how understanding a little bit of the science might actually be relevant, rather than this kind of cartoon picture of an abstract theory that's way off somewhere else in time and space. Exactly. So, I mean, a lot of these concepts that you're talking about, humanism and this celebration, kind of are relevant to that question of how this is relevant. So, I mean, how do you understand humanism, and why is it relevant to us today? I mean, you did talk about, in your other interview, you mentioned how it has these roots in Greek philosophy, and of course Erasmus. And how do you see that as sort of relevant for, certainly for you and your colleagues and peers here, but also for everyone else?
Well, the way I view our American culture at the present time, seems to me that there's a great deal of move towards secularism. And even as secularists, we need some kind of guiding principles that are ethical and moral value systems. And I see that humanism seems to me to fit very well with our transition to secularism. And I would like to think that at least Darwin Day can play a very significant role in this move away from dogmatic religions.
Oh, that's interesting. So a move away from dogmatic religions and more towards, secular humanism, or humanism almost as a kind of guiding principle.
Yes, that's the way I view it, yes.
I see. So I just want to quote this this passage that you wrote. That you were addressing a Darwin Day celebration last year. You wrote, "Perhaps the greatest threat that our planet faces today is the problem of overpopulation and all that implies here at the beginning of a new century. With the total population of the Earth approaching 7 billion, population scientists have determined it is more than 2.5 billion, or 2,500,000, too high to be sustained for very long. Stress related to insufficient food, energy, and water will increase rapidly during the next 25 to 50 years, and it will be exacerbated by global climate change. Therefore, if the promise of our original Darwin Day celebration is to be further realized, we must find new ways to encourage a large majority of our fellow citizens of the world. Join us in the hard work of continuing to educate all those willing to understand before it's too late." So my question, based on that passage, is, well, so what is the role of science education, and of Darwin Day in helping to alleviate or ameliorate that coming crisis that you described?
Well, I think that all of us have heard over and over again that the population of the world is getting very, very large. In fact, it was Malthus' work that really guided Darwin as to a mechanism as to how evolution takes place. Because when you have doubling of population, it doesn't take very long for there not to be room enough for any particular given population. It works with every biological species. The human species does not have the food chain problem that all other animals have. And so we proliferate, and we are getting there are too many people for proper acquiring food on this planet. And the only way that we can see a future, I believe, if we continue to overpopulate the world, we will simply have a great many people undergoing starvation. Now, science provides us with the answers to these particular problems. There's no reason why science, applied science, and understanding of science, especially evolutionary science, we cannot solve the problems that face us on this planet. But there are other forces, such as dogmatic religions, that will not abide by trying to recognize that there's a limit to the population density that the world can actually support.
So, carrying capacity, right?
Carrying capacity of the world, yes. And so we need to really be serious about understanding how this planet is going to survive if we're going to have overpopulation that is already out of control. Without controlling that, our future is really quite dim.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about how, so for many evolutionary psychologists, the working hypothesis is that human psychology seems to have been adapted for these small bands of hunter-gatherers, 30, 40, 50 people wandering around, and maybe in smaller groups like that, you have a sense of, maybe an intuitive sense or an instinct for the limits to the resources that are available to you in that particular area that you may be wandering around in. And yet now, in the past, I don't know, how would you say, maybe 10,000 years or so, this tremendous expansion of humans across the globe is really unprecedented and rather rapid. And so we are, I mean, the psychologists always talk about this as maladaptation, right? That we were adapted for an environment back then that doesn't exist anymore.
Well, you and I were talking about, in the other room for a little while there, about the effects of the group itself and the cooperation that's necessary to maintain a hunter-gatherer group. Within the group, they have to cooperate to obtain food. But there is also the competition with the guys next door. And so one of my views is that humanism represents this hunter-gatherer at the early stages where they had to cooperate. And we need to cooperate on a much broader base today. One of the things that is preventing us from cooperation is the dogmatic beliefs of religion. If we look at the three Abrahamic religions in the Middle East at the present time, there's just a natural understanding that they've been at each other's throat because they grew up in hunter-gatherer groups that were separated and needed to protect their areas. Now, that is no longer the problem. The problem is they're excluding each other based on their religious definitions. And that has always been a point of conflict. It goes back to the origins between adjacent hunter-gatherer groups. And it's a problem that really desperately needs to be resolved. And I believe it can be resolved through the idea of humanism and cooperation.
You said that you were raised in a family that belonged to the United Church of Canada. So I wanted to get your thoughts on whether you feel like you drifted away from its teachings, or maybe there was some kind of an aspect of maybe of greater tolerance within that particular denomination.
Well, the denomination of the United Church of Canada was made up of the Presbyterians and Methodists. A number of those churches, not all of them, but they amalgamated and became the United Church of Canada. My mother and my grandfather in particular were quite religious, and they were quite fundamentalist, as a matter of fact. And I remember being sitting by my mother on a couch with her reading me Bible stories, and I didn't have any objection to that, and as I refer to it, as an easy indoctrination. But of course, I also was involved in music in those days, and I was taking music lessons from eventually in my latter high school days. I was taking music lessons from a music teacher in London, Canada, and so I began singing solos in the major churches and so on. I continued that after I came to California. in the very early 1950 when I came to Los Angeles. And so music was a very big part of my life, but I became interested in science, and my formal education in the at the university level was in science. And so I obviously began to see the incongruency between scientific explanations for things, including evolution, including Darwinian evolution. And so I slowly drifted away mentally, at least from the church. I did continue to go to church. My wife Lola and I were married in the First Presbyterian Church of Los Angeles, where I was their tenor soloist there and sang cantatas and etc. I also was involved in music at the university and began singing in operas, etc. So the music kept me in the church, if you like. It seemed like a natural Sunday activity, I guess. But I did drift away from it as my education increased, and to the point where eventually I left the church altogether, both mentally and physically.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well, is there anything else that I didn't ask that you'd like to say about Darwin Day? This was your project. I should say again, this was your idea back in 1993, early 90s. The first event was 1995, and then it grew in the later part of the 90s, became a nonprofit organization, and then you've had all kinds of luminaries and star guests take part in your events across, I mean, first nationally, but now internationally. So is there anything, sort of closing thoughts that you'd like to say about how the event has changed? Has it sort of, has it fulfilled, or has it exceeded your expectations?
Well, in my view, it has grown very nicely. It has exceeded my expectations, I guess, at the beginning. But I also see in it at the present time that it could be much more valuable to our culture. I would like to see it become promoted in a way that it would actually be heard by the general public more than it is gaining traction at the present time. So I think the Evolution Institute, for which this is being recorded, has a great role to play in educating our secular community about the philosophy of humanism, but also the moral and ethical values that are associated with that philosophy. So I feel that, yes, there's much more room for us to celebrate Darwin science and humanity, if you like, and involved in that, of course, is our philosophy of humanism.
Well, Dr. Robert Stevens, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure for me to engage in a conversation with you.
Thank you.